I was curious and asked my mentor when I first started driving big rigs. Why do truck drivers need to rush against misfortune, but bus drivers don't? My mentor said it's because trucks carry goods, not people, and they fear encountering spirits on the road. Buses, on the other hand, are meant to pick up and drop off passengers, so they avoid misfortune on the bus. Therefore, buses don't typically rush against roads, but they do use pressing the car. I've seen most bus drivers use stones or statues to press the car. Whenever the number of passengers ends in 7 or 4, the driver will use the pressing stone, treating it as if there's an extra passenger to avoid inviting misfortune. But I recently took a strange job. A bus driver asked me to press the car as a live person. He said that before me, 3 of his pressing stones had already broken on his bus. The bus driver, William Patterson, is over 50 and nearing retirement. He looks very reliable, with gray hair at his temples and few words, reminding me of my late mentor. We agreed to meet at a stir-fry restaurant. He carried an old leather bag and, as soon as he sat down, pulled out $20,000 from it without yet speaking. The $20,000 was wrapped in a plastic bag and pushed in front of me. "I've heard of you, Lucas Brooks. You're Caleb Jackson's apprentice and often drive trucks to ward off misfortune." I didn't take the money directly but looked at William Patterson and said, "Mr. Patterson, for truck drivers, rushing against misfortune is just asking experienced drivers to familiarize themselves with new routes and settle things along the road to make it easier for fellow drivers. Bus drivers mostly travel on main roads with lots of passengers, so you shouldn't pay much attention to these things, right? We indeed don't have such customs for warding off misfortune, but I understand the rules." William Patterson said, "Those who often ward off misfortune must have a strong destiny symbol. Driving at night exposes you to many things. That's exactly the kind of person I need. I want you to help me press the car, just until the end of the month. This $20,000 is for your trouble. If anything goes wrong, I'll give you another $20,000. Why just until the end of the month? I was curious, as there were only 7 days left. This bus route is from the city to Tongxiang. The second half is on old roads. Now that the highway is being built, it will open by the end of the month, and our route will be cancelled." As William Patterson spoke, his eyebrows moved slightly, and I saw a hint of melancholy and reluctance in his eyes. "I'm originally from Tongxiang. Many of my regular passengers are my old neighbors. I've been driving them for nearly 20 years without any incidents. Now, with just a few more trips left, no matter what, I want to ensure their safety." Mr. Patterson didn't seem wealthy, but he was personally preparing the $40,000 for the safety of his passengers on the last trips. I didn't ask anything else and accepted the job. Mr. Patterson told me about some strange occurrences on his bus lately. Actually, they weren't too bizarre. Mr. Patterson said that in the past half-month, the number of passengers on his bus always ended in 7. Always 7, 17, 27, 37. Mr. Patterson's bus seats 48 people. Before, it was usually full when traveling from the city to Tongxiang because there were several villages around Tongxiang. The roads there are bad, and the villages are scattered. Only Mr. Patterson's bus goes straight to the train station near the city. However, recently, Mr. Patterson's bus always had 37 passengers when departing from the city. On the return trip, after passing through several village stops, there were always 17 or 27 passengers. Bus drivers are superstitious about having passengers end in 7 or 4, believing these numbers carry bad luck and invite evil spirits. For this half-month, I've never left my bus without a pressing stone. Mr. Patterson's expression turned gloomy. My original pressing stone was given by my mentor, an old stone I've used for many years. I had seen how bus drivers kept their pressing stones in special boxes. When they used them, they would press them onto a red cloth package containing a special ticket. Generally, it was the first batch of tickets printed or handwritten when the bus was first put into service. However, 7 days ago, it mysteriously broke. Mr. Patterson sighed deeply. "After that, I got 2 more stones, but they each lasted less than 3 days. Could it be intentional?" I asked. I suspected that too. When the first pressing stone broke, the surveillance in the bus just happened to be malfunctioning, and I wasn't there. Mr. Patterson scrunched his brow tightly. But the next 2 stones broke while I was on the bus, watching them split open. William Patterson has driven long-distance buses for over 20 years. He's heard about and seen many accidents involving buses. Things that happen once or twice can be coincidental, but not 3 or 4 times. Many major bus accidents happened after some kind of premonition or unusual sign. If drivers ignore these signs, the outcome is often disastrous. Now that 3 pressing stones have broken, Mr. Patterson can't ignore it anymore. I finished lunch quickly with Mr. Patterson and headed to the bus station with him in the afternoon. The bus station is close to the train station, with a lot of foot traffic around. Mr. Patterson's bus leaves Tongxiang at 7 in the morning and arrives at the bus station at 10:50. The return trip leaves the city at 3:50 in the afternoon and reaches Tongxiang at 7:40 in the evening. The round trip takes less than 4 hours, so there's no need for a shift change. Mr. Patterson drives himself. When we arrived at the bus station's lounge, there were already many people inside. A round-faced girl with short hair was the first to spot us and came running over. "Mr. Patterson, I'm following your shift this week." Mr. Patterson introduced her as Emily Chun, a stewardess in their team, who would be with us for the week. Emily Chun looked at me with curiosity and subtle excitement in her eyes. "Are you the one pressing the car? I heard from Mr. Patterson that you specialize in rushing against misfortune. What's it like? Is it scary?" "Okay, enough," Mr. Patterson intervened. "You should call him Lucas Brooks. He's older than you." "Lucas Brooks," Emily Chun said crisply. "Not like that," Mr. Patterson said. At that moment, a young man walked in behind us and overheard our conversation. "Are you really going to fuss over those superstitions? Not just a few broken stones? The station doesn't encourage such things anymore. You'd better be careful not to let management find out." Emily Chen's face turned sour when she saw the young man. "So what if Mr. Patterson does something? What's there to be afraid of being discovered? Besides, as long as there aren't certain gossipmongers causing trouble at the station, management won't care." The young man was slightly irritated by Emily Chun but didn't want to quarrel with her. Instead, he turned to Mr. Patterson. "If you ask me, Mr. Patterson, you've reached retirement age. Once the highway opens, you can retire with dignity. Why bother with these things for just a few more days?" Mr. Patterson clearly didn't want to engage with him, pulled out a cigarette, and handed it to me, suggesting we step out for a smoke. Emily Chun, however, was not backing down. With her hands on her hips, she said, "Who says Mr. Patterson has to retire? Some people just can't wait for Mr. Patterson to step down so they can advance. But they shouldn't assume they have what it takes." I went out with Mr. Patterson to smoke. Most drivers coming in and out would greet him. However, most were young people now. After finishing his cigarette, Mr. Patterson tossed the butt into the trash and smiled at me. "Us old guys are like the old roads. Maybe it's time for us to be replaced." When we pulled Emily Chun out of the lounge, she was still visibly upset. She whispered to me that the annoying guy was Ryan Thompson, also a driver in their team. He hadn't been there 3 years yet, but was always causing trouble at the station. Mr. Patterson was their team's longtime excellent driver and model employee. Ryan Thompson couldn't match that and always received complaints. Instead of looking at his own performance, he blamed others for blocking his way. He prided himself as a young man, disdaining the traditional practices of old drivers. However, his own driving was quite unstable. With the new highway opening and needing many trips for the passenger lines, he had been eyeing those opportunities early on. Without a doubt, Ryan Thompson was looking forward to William Patterson's retirement, perhaps so he could become the group leader. At 3:30 in the afternoon, I boarded William Patterson's bus as the first passenger. Emily Chun specially bought me the first row seat next to the door for convenience. This row of seats is usually the last to fill up. If the bus isn't full, I can sit alone and easily handle things as needed. At 3:40, passengers began to board gradually. Emily Chun had an initial count of fewer than 37 tickets sold, but there were always last-minute buyers, so it wasn't definitive yet. After about 5 or 6 minutes, the number of people boarding slowed down. Emily Chun returned to the bus and started checking tickets. "There are 33 people now," she whispered to me. I turned to look at the passengers in the cabin. Some were storing luggage, others were on phone calls, and everything seemed normal. But when I turned back, I saw a pregnant woman standing at the door. She gripped the door and asked William Patterson, "Does this bus go to Yujiao?" "Yes, it does," William Patterson replied promptly. The pregnant woman then asked if she could board without a ticket first. "You can. Just give me your ID, and the steward will help you buy one." William Patterson quickly called Emily Chun to assist the pregnant woman. Now there were 34 people on board. I mentally noted that having a number ending in 4 also required pressing the car. Just then, another person ran out from the ticketing area, a middle-aged man. As soon as he boarded, he greeted William Patterson. "Hey, David Lee. How's your old man doing?" It seemed that David Lee was an old acquaintance of William Patterson. David Lee sighed heavily. "Not well. My brother told me to go home and prepare things." Upon hearing this, William Patterson showed some sorrow but still patted David Lee on the shoulder. "The old man is 99. He's lived a long life." This was probably the only comforting thing one could say to the family of someone nearing the end of their life. David Lee forced a smile and said, "Yesterday, when my old man was lucid, he heard I was coming back to Tongxiang. He said you should take the second son's bus. He drives very steadily." William Patterson chuckled, seemingly pleased to be the second son mentioned by the old man. Just as David Lee settled in, a man wearing a construction hard hat rushed on board. He was sweating profusely and handed over cash for Emily Chun to help him purchase a ticket. The bills were damp from his sweaty hands, but he didn't remove his hard hat from start to finish. After finishing her ticket check, Emily Chun came to my side. There were 36 people now, and both of us watched the ticketing door closely. At 3:50, William Patterson closed the doors on time. Even as the bus moved, no one else came running out. Emily Chun let out a long sigh of relief. "Good. The seal is broken." Since William Patterson's bus from the city was always fully booked, there wasn't a second stop in the city. Emily Chun cheerfully checked luggage in the bus while William Patterson seemed much more relaxed. However, I felt a growing unease. If everything returned to normal, why weren't there more people on the bus? It shouldn't be like this. It usually filled up quickly. Right then, "Steward!" someone called from the back of the bus. "I haven't bought a ticket yet. Can I get one now?" I quickly turned around to see who was speaking. A young man who looked like a college student. He removed his headphones, noticing Emily Chen's astonished expression, and apologized. "Sorry, I was just on a video call and almost forgot." "How is that possible? I checked tickets and you weren't there," Emily Chen said urgently. "I was right here. I guess I was too focused on my phone and didn't notice you either," he replied. Emily Chun was stunned and hesitated to take his ID. It wasn't until William Patterson honked the horn twice that she came to her senses. Emily Chun quickly processed the late ticket and returned to her seat, stumbling slightly as she walked. William Patterson remained calm, pulling out a wooden box and handing it to Emily Chun. She brought the box to me. It was empty, with only a small red cloth package inside. The red package contained the pressing car ticket. I took the red package and tucked it into my pocket. I don't know if it was my imagination, but the moment I held the red package, the scene around me darkened significantly, as if a cloud had suddenly blocked the sun. The exorcism whip I wore around my waist also tightened in that instant. This whip was given to me by an old monk when I was young, whom I saved from a ditch. He said, "You have a demon's appearance but a bodhisattva's heart. You're destined to eat yin and yang food." Back then, I didn't take it seriously, but now in my 30s, looking back, starting from driving to ward off misfortune when I was young to now helping people exorcise and repay debts, it really matched what the old man said. This whip has saved me many times. "How do you feel?" Emily Chun asked with concern. "It's nothing, don't worry," I replied. William Patterson had already told me that being a live pressing figure was risky. From the moment I took on the role, I essentially held two tickets. One as a passenger and one as the pressing stone. My presence split into two. If my destiny wasn't strong enough, no matter what happened on the road, I would likely be the first to face consequences. Emily Chun put the box away and sat beside me, muttering, "How could this be?" I checked the tickets and went through each row. I couldn't have missed anyone. How did that young man just appear? "Don't worry about it," I reassured Emily Chun. Maybe she just didn't notice, or passengers exchanged seats privately. Emily Chun still couldn't understand and kept glancing over at the young man. He seemed like a normal person, fiddling with his phone. I looked up at William Patterson, who remained calm and focused on driving. Gradually, I felt sleepy and leaned my head against the window, dozing lightly. Long zhang dong. Strange, wavering calls seemed to drift into my ears, carried by the wind. I opened my eyes in a daze to find the bus had stopped, and everything outside was pitch black. The calls grew louder, as if just on the other side of the window. I looked out carefully to see a figure standing beyond the highway guardrail, a person I knew well, Tyler Davis. Tyler Davis was my childhood friend and former business partner. I treated him like a younger brother and protected him since we were kids. But during the 2 years I was busy taking care of a sick family member, he took control of my company, leaving me with huge debts. Later, he died on the highway, having recklessly driven to ward off misfortune despite being unqualified. It's been half a year since then. I watched him calmly, knowing this was probably just another of my dreams. I often dream about him, especially when I'm on a bus. However, I'm not afraid of anything, never have been since childhood. Besides, Tyler was a petty person. I don't believe he would have the ability to become a vengeful spirit. At that moment, the bus door creaked open, and a cold breeze blew in. Tyler was still calling out to me, but I ignored him, keeping my eyes fixed on the door. I had a feeling that something was about to come on board. Sure enough, a pale hand grasped the door handle. Was it the pregnant woman, or the worker in the hard hat? These were the two I was most suspicious of in my mind. But I was completely wrong. The one boarding was the young student, the same one Emily Chun had helped buy a ticket for just before. Why would I dream about him? He seemed perfectly normal. I kept watching the young man as he stepped into the bus, unaware of my presence. He walked normally, holding the strap of his backpack and looking around. My gaze followed him until I saw his feet. He was walking on tiptoes. I suddenly woke up and opened my eyes with a jolt. The bus was still moving, and outside it wasn't dark at all. I turned back to find the young man, only to discover he was no longer in his seat. I quickly nudged Emily Chun, who appeared to be sleeping, leaning her head against the backrest. Emily, that young man is gone." Emily moved slightly, then slowly turned her head around. But what revealed itself was not her face, but that of the young man. "Am I not here? Get out of here." The moment I reached for my exorcism whip, the scene around me changed once more, and I woke up again. Suddenly, many sounds filled the air. Conversations of passengers, snores, and the hum of the bus moving. I noticed that Emily Chun was now sitting in the front folding seat, and when she heard the commotion, she turned around. Her face was normal again. "Lucas, what's wrong? Did you have a nightmare?" "Nothing," I replied, then turned to look at the young man. He was still in his seat, keeping his face buried in the shadows. I hesitated for a long time, wondering if I should walk over and whip him. However, considering there were many other passengers on the bus, I decided not to do it to avoid causing panic. The sky outside grew darker as we approached Tongxiang. By this time, the bus had turned onto the old road. This old road was apparently built by local villagers right after the founding of the People's Republic. Over the years, it has been constantly repaired and patched up but still remains bumpy. Before reaching the final destination, the bus had 4 small stops, all convenient for villagers to get on and off. The first stop was Yujiao. When the bus stopped, Emily Chun immediately went to help the pregnant woman off. As the pregnant woman passed by me, I glanced at her feet. She was walking normally without anything unusual. I wondered if I was just imagining things, but right before she got off, she seemed to give me a deliberate glance. The second stop was Wanggang. The road to Wanggang had construction crews stationed along it. Part of the old road had been dug up and fenced off, apparently for building some kind of agricultural product area. A long temporary road had been set up next to it for vehicles to pass through. At the station, the man in the hard hat got off. He was still sweating profusely and seemed hesitant as he stepped off the bus. It was then that I realized his sweating didn't seem to be due to heat but more like nervousness or fear. The rest of the journey was relatively smooth, and we arrived at the final destination without any issues. The strange young man got off the bus with the other passengers. I never truly confirmed if he was walking on tiptoes or if it was just a dream. That night, I stayed at William Patterson's home. His wife was in the city taking care of their daughter, so he was alone. He mentioned that after retirement, he planned to move to the city to live with his daughter. However, from his words, I sensed that he didn't really want to retire. He was attached to his profession. He asked about my experience pressing the car that day, and I told him about my dream, though he couldn't confirm its meaning. He did say that when I'm pressing the car, my yang energy becomes weaker. So if there's anything malevolent, it might target me first. The next day, the 3 of us departed on schedule. David Lee boarded, and we noticed his eyes were red, clearly having cried. "What's wrong, David Lee?" William Patterson likely guessed already but still asked. "My old man passed away last night," David Lee said, his head bowed. "I hadn't even packed my clothes, and my brother called me." David Lee carried a plastic bag containing a blue, gold thread embroidered box, the type used for funeral clothing. William Patterson offered some words of comfort, telling David Lee to find a window seat where he could rest. Once we reached Yujiao, there were about 15 people on the bus. We didn't encounter any unusual events, and at Yujiao station, we saw two people again. The pregnant woman and another man. The man was very stout, had a simple appearance, and seemed to be the pregnant woman's husband, carefully helping her along. As they boarded, Emily Chun almost became used to the routine, chatting with them as she issued their tickets. It turned out the pregnant woman was headed to the city for a prenatal checkup, lacking some project results from the previous day. On the return trip, there were 17 people and I had to continue pressing the car, but nothing out of the ordinary happened. When we arrived, everyone disembarked in an orderly manner. David Lee seemed to have fallen asleep during the trip and was still dazed when he woke up. As he moved out of his seat, he collided with the pregnant woman and her husband, who were passing by. David Lee's box fell to the ground, and the deep blue funeral clothing embroidered with gold threads spilled out. David Lee cried out and hurriedly bent down to pick them up. The pregnant woman and her husband were temporarily blocked in the aisle, staring at David Lee as he gathered the clothing. I wanted to help but heard the man say, "How beautiful!" What was he referring to? Could it be the funeral clothing? Over the next 2 days, our journeys were relatively smooth. Except for occasionally dreaming about Tyler Davis, I didn't encounter anything else confusing. However, the passenger count remained stuck at multiples of 7, so I had to keep pressing the car. On the third day, many people from Tongxiang boarded our bus to attend David Lee's father's funeral. William Patterson also attended and told me later that the old man was highly respected in their area. He had spent his life accumulating virtue and was blessed with filial children. His passing at 99 was celebrated as a grand funeral. Many villagers attended. On the fourth day, as we departed from the city, an elderly woman boarded. Her body was severely hunched, her waist almost bent at a right angle, and she couldn't straighten her legs. She used a cane for support, appearing to be hanging onto it. No one accompanied her. She slowly emerged from the ticketing area and boarded last. Emily Chen offered to help, but she was pushed away. The old woman clung to the door, taking some time to finally get on, and then sat right next to me without moving further into the cabin. My size and appearance tend to discourage others from sitting beside me, but she didn't seem to mind. After sitting down, she smiled at me. "I'm old, and I walk poorly." I said nothing and made room for her. Without knowing if it was due to pressing the car for 4 days, the light around me seemed to dim. In the late afternoon, even though the sun hadn't set, everything looked gray and dull, as if the entire world had aged. I glanced out the window to see vast fields beyond the guardrail. Just as my eyes started to feel better, I was dazed to see a figure standing behind my reflection in the window. The person was tall and thin, holding a stick and swinging it towards my head. I quickly turned around, and what met my gaze was the elderly woman's face. She was smiling at me, her wrinkles gathered together, revealing yellowed teeth, which seemed strangely mismatched. Throughout the rest of the journey, I never turned my back to her again. I couldn't hit an elderly woman just because of a shadow, so I remained cautious. Finally, we reached Tongxiang, and she got off the bus. As she slowly stood up, I noticed she seemed taller without hunching. For a moment, she appeared much taller than usual, but that was fleeting, and she quickly returned to her hunched posture. At that moment, I suddenly recalled what seemed inconsistent earlier. This elderly woman looked to be 70 or 80 years old, yet her teeth were perfect, just like those of a young person with no signs of decay. On the 5th day morning, fewer people boarded our bus because the highway's special line had opened. However, many villagers still chose William Patterson's bus, finding it more reliable and closer than the highway stations. When we reached Yujiao, the pregnant woman boarded again. This time, she was alone, supporting her belly, and looked pale. Emily Chun quickly went to help her, carefully guiding her to her seat. After the bus started moving, Emily Chun repeatedly checked on the pregnant woman's condition. The pregnant woman seemed very grateful to Emily Chun and asked her to touch her belly. At first, Emily Chun resisted, but the woman was too enthusiastic, holding onto her hand without letting go and even unzipped her jacket. I had been suspicious of the pregnant woman and her husband, observing them closely, but as she began to undress, I shifted my gaze away. I'm not sure if Emily Chun touched her or not, but soon, Emily Chun walked back to me without saying anything. She simply returned to her seat in the front folding row. Later, I felt drowsy again and fell asleep, leaning back. In my haze, I thought I heard Emily Chun muttering to herself, "She's not pregnant." That's not a child. I didn't expect that when I woke up. The bus had reached its destination, and Emily Chun was unconscious from a high fever. William Patterson and I hastily lifted her off the bus and took her to the emergency medical center at the bus station. In a rush, I thought of the pregnant woman, but when I ran outside, she was nowhere to be seen. An ambulance took Emily Chun away. She was such a bright and kind girl. Just that morning, she was helping an elderly person onto the bus and chatting with passengers. In just a few hours, she was burning with a fever so high that her skin looked transparent, and she was carried away like a fragile doll. I could barely contain my anger, hoping that this had nothing to do with the pregnant woman. Otherwise, I might lose my temper if I saw her again. That afternoon, the bus company didn't assign a new attendant for William Patterson. This was probably because many new lines had opened, and staff were already understaffed at the station. Ryan Thompson saw William Patterson and couldn't help but raise his chin high in pride. He too had opened a new line which happened to go to Tongxiang. William Patterson was worried about Emily Chun and kept calling the hospital, completely ignoring Ryan Thompson. Others did warn Ryan Thompson to be careful when he returned that night. Earlier that morning, another driver running the same route experienced something strange. A passenger vanished midway through the trip. The attendant remembered a young man in the back row, but he suddenly disappeared without explanation. Ryan Thompson scoffed at the idea, pointing to William Patterson and saying, "You guys should consult experts on this. We young folks just need solid skills. We're not afraid of anything." Unfortunately, we heard that Ryan Thompson had an accident that night. His bus was rear-ended on the highway. Police at the scene quickly concluded that Ryan Thompson was primarily responsible, as he had slammed on the brakes without giving the following car any reaction time. Luckily, there weren't many people on the bus, and neither vehicle was moving fast. Nonetheless, for the bus company, this was a significant incident. What surprised me was seeing Ryan Thompson at the departure point the next day. Station management called William Patterson, instructing him to let Ryan Thompson work as an attendant for the day to assess his performance before deciding on his future. It seemed that management wasn't naive. While handling Ryan Thompson's situation, they temporarily suspended those two Tongxiang-bound highway lines. Ryan Thompson no longer looked confident. When he saw us, he hung his head in shame. William Patterson, seeing his state, frowned and said, "If you're in such a spirits, you might as well take a leave. No need to come today." Ryan Thompson, fearing dismissal, quickly shook his head. "No need. I'm fine." "What happened yesterday?" William Patterson asked. "You slammed on the brakes on the highway. Was something wrong with your head?" Ryan Thompson's face flushed red as he defended himself. "It wasn't intentional. I was startled. I was driving along fine when suddenly someone spoke in my ear. It was a woman's voice. I heard it clearly on my left side, but my left side is against the window. How could there be anyone?" "What did she say?" I asked. Ryan Thompson stammered. "She asked, 'Does your bus go to Yujiao?'" I immediately recalled the pregnant woman. She asked William Patterson the same question when she first boarded. But how could she have ended up on the highway? "Where were you exactly when it happened?" I asked Ryan Thompson. He thought for a moment. "I was halfway through the trip. Yeah, around the exit for the old road to Tongxiang." I suddenly realized something. There's a connection between the highway and the old road to Tongxiang. Is there an exit to get onto the old road? Ryan Thompson nodded. "Yes, there is, but I don't know if it'll remain open. Once the old road is dug up, that exit might be closed." The three of us boarded the bus, and again there were more passengers today. When we reached Wangang, we saw that several fences at the construction site had been removed, revealing part of the old road that had been dug up. Some construction workers also got on the bus at this point. The passengers began chatting with the workers, curious about the diggings. A middle-aged man asked, "Hey, brother, we heard you've dug up something at the construction site. Is that true?" A worker replied, "True. It's been causing trouble for half a month now. If it weren't for the deadline, our boss wouldn't want to continue." "What did you dig up? Coffins?" someone asked out of curiosity. "No coffins." The worker shook his head. "It was human bone fragments, around 7. But we couldn't find any skulls." Someone speculated, "Could it be that it's a family? Were they murdered?" A young man chimed in, "No, it wasn't a family. My grandfather told me that bones are buried under the old road. It was a group of killers. Back when the country was first founded, they committed crimes around this area. They would disguise themselves as old folks or pregnant women to deceive people, then kill them very brutally. My grandfather said there were families where the men had their scalps peeled off, and if there were pregnant women, their bellies were cut open. It took years for the killers to be caught. Apparently, they were stoned to death by the villagers at their execution. Since it was during road construction, the locals said they buried them beneath the road, so they'd be trampled by thousands, never able to rest in peace. The young man's story scared the faces pale, especially the construction workers. An elderly woman spoke up. "This is so vicious. Now that they've been dug up, aren't they bound to cause more trouble?" Ryan Thompson, hearing this in the front, had his hair stand on end. I paid no mind to him, thinking that tomorrow was the 7th day, and this whole thing seemed to be connected to the number 7. When we arrived in the city at noon, I heard that Emily Chun was a bit better. I called to check on her. She trembled as she told me that the pregnant woman had been very enthusiastic about letting her touch her belly. Emily Chun couldn't resist the woman's insistence and lightly touched it. However, instead of a rounded belly, she felt a round, hard object. At that moment, the woman had unzipped her jacket, revealing a tight-fitting shirt underneath. Emily Chun felt odd and glanced down to see a human face. The prominent features left Emily Chen's mind reeling. She didn't have time to react before the woman zipped her jacket back up and smiled at her. Emily Chun wasn't sure if she was hallucinating or if she really saw the woman hiding a human head inside her clothes. She just returned to her seat in a haze and soon began to feel feverish, unaware of anything else. I reassured Emily Chun to rest well. Emily Chun repeatedly warned us to be careful. That afternoon, we departed on schedule. Ryan Thompson was visibly agitated and almost got into an argument with a passenger before I dragged him back to his spot near the door, which calmed him down. The number of passengers leaving the city today was different, 47, just one short of full capacity. Once again, I took the red cloth package from the wooden box. As soon as I touched it, the scene around me darkened abruptly. I heard a clear burst of laughter in my ear, sounding like children mixed with the coarse tone of an adult. "Lucas Brooks! Lucas Brooks!" Ryan Thompson's repeated calls brought my vision back to normal a little. Ryan Thompson's face turned white as paper. "Lucas Brooks, are you okay? Maybe we should tell Mr. Patterson not to run this trip today." I waved my hand. "No need, just go sit down." At this moment, the light around me wasn't as dim as before. It was overly clear, almost like a finely adjusted image. Everything seemed fake, like a painting. I slowly looked around. The passengers' actions seemed normal. However, when I turned my head and looked towards the back of the bus, I saw two dark shadows standing before two seats. They were very tall and standing openly before those seats. I couldn't remember who had been sitting there before. Nothing seemed out of place when the passengers boarded. The next second, those shadows moved forward by one seat, and I heard that laughter again in my ear. They were coming for me. No, more precisely, they were coming for the pressing stone. Now I understood why the 3 pressing stones had broken. I slowly stood up, my hand gripping the exorcism whip at my waist. However, at this moment, the whip showed no unusual signs, no vibrations, no heat. "Damn it!" I cursed under my breath, still cautious because there were 47 passengers on the bus. Yet, once I stood up, those shadows didn't continue forward. They retreated instead. We remained in this standoff until William Patterson drove the bus to Wongang. The bus stopped, and some passengers were getting off. I turned my head to look out the window, seeing that more fence panels had been dismantled at the construction site, leaving only a small piece of the old road intact. Suddenly, a dark shadow enveloped me. My thoughts slowed, and an icy hand grasped my hair, slamming my head against the window. Boom! The sound made everyone turn around. I heard William Patterson shouting, "Lucas Brooks!" A warm flow ran from my forehead as I pulled out the exorcism whip and swung it behind me. But there was nothing there. Another burst of mocking laughter echoed in my ear. That night, William Patterson saw my bandaged forehead and, for the first time, suggested giving up. He said, "Lucas Brooks, let's just forget it. We only have 1 day left. I'll tell the company not to run this line anymore." "No way." I refused outright. "Tomorrow is the 7th day, and those things won't give up halfway. Moreover, they can now use the highway. Unless the road in Tongxiang never opens, accidents will happen sooner or later." William Patterson looked at my forehead, still hesitant. I smiled at him. "If those things dare to take my life, I'll become a vengeful spirit and tear them apart." On the last day, Ryan Thompson ran off, and his phone and messages couldn't be reached. Neither I nor William Patterson was surprised. One less person like him wouldn't make a difference anyway. At Wongang Station, the construction workers got on again. They chatted with other passengers about finishing the old road today, working double shifts without breaks. The boss had them surround the area, which was now nearly dug up and expected to be completely severed that night. Hearing the workers' conversation, I remembered something. I took out a pack of cigarettes and approached them. I wasn't sure if my plan would work, but I had to try something rather than just wait for disaster. On the way to the city, nothing else unusual happened. Although there were still 17 people, the situation remained eerily calm, and I didn't see the two black shadows again. In the afternoon, it started raining in the city, and the sky grew gloomy. I arrived at the departure point with William Patterson right on schedule, and there were 47 people again today. I kept a close watch on each passenger boarding. They all seemed normal. That was until I saw the man who was always sweating and wearing a hard hat. He carried a basket with a dirty mat covering it. I stopped him. "What's in the basket?" He seemed frightened but took off the basket and lifted the mat to show me. "Watermelons. Do you want to eat one?" Inside the basket were indeed some round watermelons, some with mud, likely freshly picked. I let him pass and he took his basket onto the bus. Then, a dignified elderly man with snow-white hair, neatly combed, and finely dressed, walked up behind us. He nodded to both me and William Patterson before boarding. At 3:50, we departed on schedule. This time, when I touched the red cloth package, I felt unwell, and my body weakened. I forced myself to stay alert and observe my surroundings. The rain outside intensified, and the sky grew darker. After passing Yujiao, the darkness outside was almost palpable. I began to hear chewing sounds coming from the back of the bus. Following the noise, I saw the man in the hard hat eating something. Was he eating the watermelon? I frowned at him, worried about how he might affect the other passengers. But then I realized that everyone else on the bus was asleep. Just as I pulled out my exorcism whip, the bus jolted violently. I turned to see William Patterson's head nodding forward as if falling asleep. "Mr. Patterson," I shouted. He managed to stay awake a little, grabbing the nearby thermos and pouring scalding tea over his head. I stood up and headed towards the strange man. His eyes were wide as he watched me, his mouth still moving steadily. As I approached, I realized he wasn't eating watermelon. He was gnawing on something. What he was gnawing on wasn't a watermelon at all but human skulls. By then, we had reached Wongang, and naturally, no one got off. William Patterson drove onto the temporary road. I was about to swing my whip when an immense force grabbed my arm from behind. I heard that annoying laughter again. I watched in horror as the heads transformed into the pregnant woman, her husband, the student walking on tiptoes, and the tall man disguised as an elderly woman. They transformed into black shadows, passing through my body one by one. I felt a moment of confusion, as if enduring the suffering of those past victims. The air was filled with tragic screams and cruel laughter. I roared in anger and managed to free my arm, grabbing the perverted man's neck with both hands. My strength might have been too much, as I squeezed his head out of his fake cavity. His agonized wails filled the bus. I snatched the filthy head and threw it out the window. The other shadows rushed towards me, enraged. I raised my arm and swung my exorcism whip through the air. The whip cracked 3 times. It sounded like thunder. The shadows howled as they retreated, chased by me and whipped into the air outside the bus. William Patterson regained control of the steering wheel as we reached the construction site. The bus shook again. Something climbed onto the wheel. William Patterson opened the door, and I looked out to see the 7 human heads clinging to the rear wheel. They hadn't given up. They wanted to flip the bus and bury everyone on it. My peripheral vision revealed the oblivious passengers, helpless like lambs about to be slaughtered, as the bus rocked with the movements. Just then, a voice boomed. "Second son, hold the wheel steady. Grandfather is here to keep guard." I realized the dignified old man was David Lee's father, who had passed away at 99 years old. Today happened to be the 7th day after his death. I glanced towards the old man, who was sitting diagonally in front of me. The old man extended his hand and said, "Young man, give me that ticket. I can keep them in check." I didn't have time to think. I twisted my arm and pulled out the red cloth package from my pocket. I tossed it towards the old man, and at that moment, a surge of bloodlust burst from my heart. The suppressed anger and suddenly restored strength surged out all at once. I broke free from the shadows holding me and grasped the perverted man's neck. I might have used too much force. His head was squeezed out of the fake cavity. His cries filled the bus as I snatched the dirty head and flung it out the window. To my surprise, it passed through the closed window and was flung outside. The other shadows rushed towards me in anger. I raised my arm, swinging my exorcism whip through the air. The whip cracked 3 times. It sounded like thunder. The shadows howled as they retreated, chased by me and whipped into the air outside the bus. William Patterson grasped the steering wheel tightly as we reached the construction site. The bus swayed again. Something climbed onto the wheel. William Patterson opened the door, and I looked out to see the 7 human heads wrapped around the rear wheel. They hadn't given up. They wanted to flip the bus and kill everyone on it. My peripheral vision showed the oblivious passengers, helpless like lambs about to be slaughtered, as the bus rocked with the movements. I yelled at William Patterson, "Hold on until we get onto the old road. They're afraid of it. Why did these things, dug up half a month ago, still linger on this old road?" They seemed unable to leave and had to return somehow. It seemed they couldn't fully detach from the road that had buried them for decades. They had caused so much trouble and chose to appear collectively today. I bet they were waiting for the day when the road would be severed. William Patterson gripped the wheel tightly, hearing my shout, and floored it. The veins on his temples bulged, and the rear wheels almost lost control. But finally, as the bus was about to tip over, we managed to get back onto the old road. A piercing screech of brakes sounded, and the 7 heads were flung onto the road. The uneven road surface suddenly gave way, revealing a large pit. The old road, which had endured for decades, once again buried the 7 heads. At 7:40 in the evening, we arrived at our destination right on time. It wasn't until then that the passengers slowly came to, dazed, as they gathered their belongings to disembark, all safe and sound. I looked towards the old man's seat. He was gone, but the small red cloth package was neatly placed on his seat. Afterwards, William Patterson personally delivered the $40,000 to my home. I hadn't wanted that much money, but he insisted that if I didn't accept it, he would feel guilty for the rest of his life. So I accepted it. William Patterson told me that Emily Chun had recovered quickly and was still spirited, unafraid despite her frightening experience. Ryan Thompson was fired, and his spirit was completely broken. He vowed not to drive again. What pleased William Patterson even more was that the bus company's leadership personally approached him, wanting him not to retire yet and to continue working for another 2 years to mentor new drivers. As for the old road, it ultimately wasn't completely severed. The developers felt that the site was too unlucky and abandoned their plans. The city decided to leave the old road intact, repair it, and use it as a secondary road in the future. On the day the road was refilled, William Patterson and I both attended. William Patterson picked up a stone from the roadside, which was round at the top and flat at the bottom, perfectly fitting the box for the pressing stone. William Patterson told me that this stone was a gift from the road. He planned to pass it down in the future whenever he retired. Even if it became useless, someone would always remember its contribution to protecting people.